Hello there, welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 1, Episode 4, Exit Prentiss Carr. Written by Roy Huggins and Juanita Bartlett and directed by Alexander Grassoff. The episode begins with Jim mid-case, with what should be a straightforward missing person, as Janet Carr has hired Jim not to find her husband Prentiss, as she knows where he is, but just to check he's okay, as he's not answering her calls. He goes to the motel room where Prentiss is supposed to be and knocks the door, getting no answer. He tries it and it's open. Inside there are signs of a struggle, and Prentiss's body is lying dead next to the bed. Jim finds the gun that killed Prentiss behind the curtains, and he goes to report it to the cops. Sort of. He can't tell them he was in the room or he'll be arrested for breaking and entering, so he asks them to check the motel, which they eventually agreed to do. Sometime later, the cops return and want to speak to Rockford as they found Prentiss's body and are content it's a suicide. They say the door was locked, there was no sign of a struggle, and the gun was in his hand. Jim is naturally baffled by this, and his case has become a lot more complicated. This is a really interesting hook for an episode. We know what Jim saw, so are the cops lying for some reason, or was the murderer still hanging around? Having already seen how Jim works, we know he would likely not have taken the case if he thought there was more to it than simply checking up on someone. So it's another novel way to get him into a story he might have otherwise avoided. He goes to see Janet Carr, played by Corinne Camacho, in her first of several appearances as different characters on the show, wanting to know where she was, as she was supposed to be home all night, but the cops couldn't get a hold of her. She claims she went out to buy a magazine, but Jim isn't so sure she's telling the truth.
I didn't have anything to read.
Did you get bored with all the travel folders?
After giving her the bad news and letting her know she will be a suspect, she tries to get him to stay the night, which he refuses as he knows how bad this would look to the cops.
Jim, don't go. I don't want to be alone tonight.
The cops will be dropping by any minute. Believe me, they wouldn't understand.
This is a really interesting plot point, as it neatly steers away from traditional detective story cliches of femme fatales and seduced PIs, and tells us that no, that's not the story we're telling here. Once again, it points to the idea of corrupt cops instead. This is further reinforced when Rockford goes to the chief of police to tell him what he really saw, and the cops who investigated firmly deny that they rearranged the scene.
He claims Prentiss Carr was murdered, and you two rearranged things to make it look like suicide.
That's a lie.
And the chief supports them.
I've known both of these men for a long time. They're good men and they're good cops. You? I never saw you before in my life.
Jim is naturally incensed by this, especially when the same cops run him out of town.
Stay out of Bay City.
Well, you're making it kind of hard for me, Lieutenant. You see, I can't stay out until you let me leave, and I can't leave as long as you're leaning on me.
If you're stupid enough to come back here and we pull you over for a traffic violation, you reach in for your ID, we think you're going for a gun.
It now makes sense why this is taking place outside of Jim's normal base of operations, as there's no way Dennis would have allowed this. It seems like these two detectives, played by Warren J. Kemmerling and Mills Watson, who would both crop up in later episodes as different characters, are indeed corrupt, just not in the way that Rockford thought. It's an interesting way to introduce police corruption to a series that would return to that subject a few times over the years. They aren't on the take, or criminals themselves. They are just willing to use their authority to intimidate others which might not seem as dangerous at first, but police intimidation was a serious problem at the time, and one that law enforcement did little to deal with correctly. So it's really interesting to see the show deal with this topical issue of the day, but do so in a manner that was sanitized enough to not condemn the entire legal system. Jim returns to Janet, and he's concerned with how cool she is in the face of Prentiss's murder, even after she explains how she no longer loved him after a string of affairs.
Prentiss is dead. And I'm sorry, whatever you think. Genuinely and deeply sorry. But I'm not going to pretend emotions I don't feel.
He asks her where she was again, and she admits this time that she was with another man that she was contemplating having her own affair with. It seems like this episode is taking us on a bit of a journey in terms of suspects, initially making it look like maybe the cops were somehow involved, but now pointing the finger squarely at the wife, who not only lacks an alibi but is doing everything possible to make herself look guilty, which Jim is fully aware of, especially when Janet tries to point the finger at him as she tries to persuade him to investigate further. Is this all just to throw him off the scent, or is she too a red herring? Jim looks into Prentiss's work as an insurance controller but finds nothing, so looks into a receipt for a liquor store that Janet found in Bay City, the city he just got run out of. So he borrows her car and discovers the liquor store delivered to the house of a young lady. But as he's staking out her house, his two least favourite cops show up and threaten him further.
What are you doing here?
Hi, Lieutenant.
Making it seem like maybe they are guilty of Prentiss's murder. This is quite the roller coaster of suspects, especially when we find out that Janet is a teacher at a school for the deaf. Surely she couldn't have killed anyone. The girl's house that Jim staked out is that of Nancy Hellman, a secretary of Prentiss's firm. So he tells Janet he now has two suspects, Nancy and her, which she doesn't take kindly to, but he doesn't much care by this point.
Look, Janet, either you're good for this killing or you're not. Now, I want to believe all this, but you also want to run off to Tahiti and spend all the money that Prentiss left you. That makes me wonder why.
Forced to borrow another friend's car, he returns to Nancy's and follows her to the pier, where she has a clandestine meeting with Prentiss's boss, who Jim had earlier spoken to about Prentiss's career. Nancy is the closest thing to a Columbo connection that I spotted in this episode, having been in John Cassavetes, Minnie and Moskowitz a few years prior. But if you spotted any more, please do let me know in the comments. Jim is spotted and followed to Nancy's house by someone else, until he turns the tables, only to be foiled by the unreliability of the car he's driving. As a result of this, he switches cars again, this time borrowing Rocky's truck, with Rocky managing to con him into filling the dual fuel tanks.
Rocky, you've got dual fuel tanks in this thing. That'll take me 40 gallons.
I don't use no regular, no sir.
I really like this seemingly unnecessary car switching subplot, as it shows not just Jim's cunning but also his determination to find Prentiss's killer. The obstacle of the cops out to get him, which he arguably is responsible for, add an extra element that brings a little more to the story than just solving the case. He returns to Nancy Hellman's, determined to get some answers, only to discover that she has been murdered. He also finds out the guy who was following him was Nancy's boyfriend. He reluctantly calls the angry cops in, and as he leaves the scene, he's once again followed by Nancy's apparent boyfriend. This leads to a short car chase to a lumber mill, where Rockford eventually gets the better of the guy. This little sequence perhaps goes on a bit too long, but the addition of the mill worker nervously calling the cops at a time before 911 is a neat way of bringing realism to the scene and breaking up the action.
I need the number for the Bay City Police Department.
To at least give the appearance that they aren't just wandering around a couple of small piles of wood. Rockford gets the better of the boyfriend, who thinks Jim killed Nancy, and who was in on the blackmail.
Going back for my car?
No, I'm turning you over to the cops.
You said we had a deal.
I lied.
Prentiss's boss was crooked. Prentiss found out, and so the boss killed him. Nancy made it look like a suicide so she could continue the blackmail until she herself was murdered by Prentiss's boss. As Jim clears everything up at the police station, the chief wants him to apologise, and we get a fun little button with the two cops who've made his case a misery.
I think you should buy me a drink.
Are you kidding? I'm not gonna buy you a drink.
Oh, come on, Earl. Let's buy him a drink. Then we'll run him out of town.
Now, why didn't I think of that?
Then Jim wraps things up with Janet, in a scene that gives her a little more humanity than she's previously had, mostly for our benefit, as we were supposed to consider her a suspect right up until this point. This is a neatly worked episode that has a relatively simple mystery that Jim is able to relatively easily crack. But the roadblocks put in his way give it more depth than the basic plotline. It's a clever way of stretching the plot to fit the runtime by adding a whole subplot rather than padding the episode. This is something I think the Rockford Files does brilliantly, taking a very basic mystery that would really only take 15 or 20 minutes of screen time and adding enough clever twists, dead ends, red herrings and barriers to make it work without feeling overstretched or overstuffed. The car switching and the corrupt cops could easily have been overdone, but the way that the subplot builds prevents it from becoming stale, especially with Jim eventually having to call them in. I really can't fault any element of this episode, so this one is a 5 out of 5 for me. Thank you. Goodbye.